His dog uncovered a buried military bunker, but the men hunting it had already murdered to keep it hidden. Rain hammered the sheriff's office parking lot as Ethan Cole watched his life spill across the pavement, medals, photographs, and a folded American flag soaking beside a broken cardboard box. After losing his ranch, his wife, and the home they built over 35 years, the homeless former Navy SEAL thought he had nothing left but his aging K-9 partner. Then Ranger led him deep into the Bitterroot Mountains, to a forgotten cabin hiding a secret powerful men had buried for 40 years. Comment 1 or 0 and tell us where you're watching from. The cardboard box hit the pavement hard enough to burst open. Tape split. Wet photographs scattered across the parking lot outside the sheriff's office in Darby, Montana. A folded American flag slid through a shallow puddle and stopped against the curb. 3 military medals spun across the concrete before settling beside the tire of a county cruiser. Rain hammered the pavement in silver sheets. Ethan Cole stood motionless beside the open tailgate of his truck, while the repossession agent climbed back into the tow vehicle without another word. The younger man never looked him in the eye. He just shut the door, turned the wipers on high, and pulled away from the curb like he had another appointment waiting somewhere farther down the valley. Maybe he did. People always had somewhere else to be. At 63 years old, Ethan looked larger than most men, even with age bending his shoulders slightly forward. The years had hardened him instead of softening him. Deep lines cut across his weathered face beneath a gray beard trimmed short and uneven. Rain soaked through the collar of his old canvas jacket and darkened the sleeves all the way to the wrists. Beside him stood Ranger. The black German shepherd was nearly as soaked as Ethan, rainwater dripping from his thick coat onto the pavement. A pale scar ran along the dog's left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through muscle years earlier overseas. One ear stood straight, while the tip of the other folded slightly forward from an old injury that never healed right. Ranger stared at the road where the tow truck disappeared. Then he growled, low, deep, not at the truck, at the mountains. The Bitterroots rose dark and enormous behind the town, hidden partly by fog and rain clouds. Pine forests climbed the slopes in endless layers of shadow. Ranger had been staring at those mountains for 3 days, ever since the last break-in at the ranch. A deputy standing beneath the sheriff's office awning shifted uncomfortably and called out over the rain, "You can't leave your stuff spread out here, Mr. Cole." Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked slowly into the rain instead and bent down stiffly to pick up the folded flag. His knees cracked audibly when he crouched. Water dripped from his beard onto the soaked fabric while he brushed mud from the edge with rough, trembling fingers. That flag had covered his father's coffin in 1971. His father had served in Vietnam. Ethan had carried the same flag folded in a cedar chest for over 40 years. Now it smelled like rainwater and gasoline. He tucked it carefully beneath his arm and reached for a photograph lying face down near the curb. Elaine. The picture had been taken 20 years earlier at Flathead Lake during late summer. Elaine stood smiling into the wind with one hand holding her hat against her blonde hair. Laugh lines framed her eyes. Ethan remembered exactly what she had been laughing at. He had burned the hamburgers. She teased him about it for 15 years afterward. The memory hit him so suddenly that his chest tightened. For one dangerous second he couldn't breathe. Rain blurred his vision. Not tears, rain. At least, that was what he told himself. Ranger nudged Ethan's elbow gently with his nose. The dog always knew. Ethan swallowed hard and looked away from the photograph before the grief could open fully inside him. He had spent the last 7 months trying to keep that door shut, ever since Elaine died. A stroke. No warning, no time to say goodbye. 1 minute, she had been standing in the kitchen arguing with him about replacing the porch light before winter. 20 minutes later, she was unconscious on the hardwood floor, while Ethan screamed her name into a 911 operator who kept telling him to stay calm. Stay calm. As if calm existed after hearing your wife collapse in the next room. As if calm survived watching 35 years disappear beneath fluorescent hospital lights. The rain intensified. Traffic rolled slowly past the sheriff's office. Most drivers glanced once toward Ethan and then quickly away. Nobody stopped. A woman carrying grocery bags hurried past under an umbrella without making eye contact. A teenage boy pumping gas across the street stared openly at Ethan's scattered belongings before his mother pulled him toward the truck by the sleeve. Invisible. That was the strange thing about losing everything. You didn't become more noticeable. You became less. The deputy stepped off the awning finally and approached carefully, boots splashing through puddles. His name tag read Murphy, young, maybe 26. Too young to understand what humiliation looked like after it settled into a man's bones. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly. "You okay?" Ethan almost laughed at the question. Okay, his ranch was gone. His bank accounts were frozen. The mortgage papers he thought had been settled years ago turned out tied to a land trust controlled by Elaine's brother, Dennis Whitaker, who had moved through probate proceedings faster than grief itself. And now the truck was gone too. The old Ford had been the last thing Ethan actually owned outright. He looked at the deputy for a long moment before answering. "No," he said simply. The honesty seemed to catch Murphy off guard. The deputy shifted awkwardly in the rain. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" Ethan glanced toward Ranger. The dog's attention remained fixed on the mountains beyond town. Muscles along his shoulders stayed tense beneath the wet fur. 3 nights before Elaine's funeral, someone had broken into Ethan's barn. Nothing stolen, just searched. Drawers dumped onto the floor, old storage trunks pried open, feed sacks sliced apart, tools scattered everywhere. The second night they came back. The third night, Ranger nearly tore through the screen door trying to get outside, while headlights disappeared beyond the pasture fence. Whoever they were, they had been looking for something. And ever since then, Ranger had not stopped staring toward the mountains. "I'll figure it out," Ethan finally answered. Murphy hesitated. "There's a veterans shelter in Missoula sometimes takes guys short-term. Appreciate it." The deputy nodded once and stepped back beneath the awning, relieved the conversation was over. Ethan gathered the rest of the photographs carefully. Elaine in the garden, Luke holding his first trout, Christmas mornings, branding cattle, ordinary moments, the kind people think will last forever until they don't. One photograph stopped him cold, the barn, taken last winter after the first heavy snowfall. In the corner of the picture behind the tractor sat an old green military storage crate. Ethan hadn't opened in years. His pulse slowed strangely, then quickened, because the crate had been open after the break-ins. He remembered that clearly now, not empty, just opened. And inside it, Ranger barked sharply. Ethan looked up. The dog stood rigid beside the curb, facing the western highway leaving town. A dark SUV rolled slowly through the rain about half a block away. Black, tinted windows. Moving too slowly. The vehicle paused briefly at the intersection, then continued north toward the mountains. Ranger growled again. The sound vibrated deep in his chest. Ethan watched the SUV disappear into the rain until only its taillights remained. Something cold settled into his stomach. Not fear, recognition. The same feeling he used to get overseas right before things went bad. The sense that pieces were moving somewhere beyond your line of sight. He looked back down at the soaked photograph of the barn in his hand, then at Ranger. The dog finally turned away from the highway and looked directly at him, waiting, as if he already knew where they needed to go next. The rain continued falling over Darby while Ethan packed the last of his life back into a broken cardboard box beside the sheriff's office. and high above the town, hidden deep inside the Bitterroot Mountains, something waited in the dark that powerful men had spent nearly 40 years trying to bury. Ranger had already found the scent. Ethan just didn't know it yet. The rain finally stopped sometime after midnight. Cold fog settled across the Bitterroot Valley while Ethan sat inside the cab of his old Ford parked behind a closed gas station outside Hamilton, Montana. The truck smelled like wet canvas, motor oil, and dog fur. Condensation coated the inside of the windshield in cloudy streaks that blurred the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. Ranger slept with his body pressed against the driver's side door. Even asleep, the dog remained alert. One ear twitched at distant sounds. A diesel engine down on the highway. Boots crunching gravel near the dumpsters. Wind moving through pine trees somewhere beyond the truck stop. Ethan sat awake with a wool blanket over his shoulders, staring at the photograph of Elaine he had rescued from the rain earlier that afternoon. The dashboard clock read 2:13 a.m. Sleep wouldn't come, not anymore. Every time he drifted too close to unconsciousness, the dreams started. Afghanistan, night raids, gunfire bouncing through narrow alleys, the scream of helicopter rotors overhead, faces. Always faces, some American, some not. Men Ethan had buried years ago still walked through his dreams, like they were waiting for him somewhere, just beyond waking. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. Low growl. Ethan froze instantly. Training overrode exhaustion before conscious thought could catch up. His hand moved automatically beneath the seat toward the old tactical knife taped there years ago. Silence. Then headlights swept briefly across the far end of the parking lot. A dark SUV rolled slowly past the station entrance, black, tinted windows. The same vehicle from outside the sheriff's office. It didn't stop, just continued down the highway, before disappearing into the darkness toward the mountains. Ranger remained rigid long after the taillights vanished. Ethan's pulse slowed gradually. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. The problem with men who had lived too long in dangerous places was simple. Eventually, they stopped believing in coincidence. He rubbed a hand across his face and leaned back against the seat. "You're seeing ghosts," he muttered quietly. Ranger kept staring through the windshield. By morning, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Thin ice-covered puddles across the cracked asphalt lot behind the station. Ethan washed his face in the restroom sink while Ranger waited outside the door, beside a vending machine, humming softly in the dawn. The man in the mirror barely looked familiar anymore. Gray beard, bloodshot eyes. A deep scar along the jawline from an explosion outside Kandahar 12 years earlier. He looked older than 63, not physically, spiritually. Like life had sanded him down slowly over time until only hard edges remained. The diner across the road opened at 6. Ethan ordered black coffee and eggs because they were cheap. Ranger curled beneath the booth beside his boots while truckers filled the counter, talking about snow coming into the passes by evening. Nobody recognized Ethan. That part helped. Small-town pity was harder to survive than hunger. A waitress around Luke's age refilled his coffee without asking questions. Her name tag read Cindy. When she noticed Ranger beneath the table, her face softened slightly. Service dog? Ethan nodded once. Combat K9. She looked down at Ranger again differently after that. Not fear, respect. "Well," she said quietly, "breakfast for him's on me." She returned a minute later with bacon wrapped in napkins. Ranger accepted it carefully from Ethan's hand. For the first time in 2 days, the dog's tail moved slightly. That almost hurt worse. Kindness always did after enough humiliation. Outside the diner, wind rattled the flagpole near the highway, while Ethan stood smoking beside the truck. He had quit cigarettes 3 times in his life. After Bud Cess, after Luke was born, after Elaine got sick. Now here he was again lighting one with shaking hands behind a roadside diner at sunrise. The Veterans Assistance Office in Missoula occupied a brick building beside a pawn shop and an empty laundromat. Ethan arrived just before noon, after driving west through miles of gray mountain roads dusted with early snow. Inside smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. 3 other veterans sat quietly in folding chairs along the wall. Nobody talked much. A television, mounted near the ceiling, played daytime news no one watched. The woman behind the desk looked exhausted before Ethan even reached the counter. Her name was Janice, late 50s, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "How can we help you today?" "Help." The word sounded foreign now. Ethan removed his ball cap slowly. "Need temporary housing," he said. "Just till I figure things out." Janice typed something into the computer while Ranger lay beside Ethan's boots. "How old's your dog?" "9, beautiful shepherd. He's smarter than me." That earned the faintest smile from her. Then it disappeared as she studied the screen. "I can get you 2 nights at a motel outside town," she said carefully. "After that, shelters are pretty full right now." Ethan nodded once. No anger, no disappointment. You learned eventually not to expect systems to save you. Janice lowered her voice slightly. "You VA? Yeah. You in counseling? No. You should think about it." Ethan almost answered automatically. "I'm fine." Every veteran said it, even the ones drowning. Instead, he looked down at Ranger lying beside him. The dog watched the room constantly, even while resting. Every opening door made one ear twitch. Every raised voice tightened the muscles across his shoulders. Ranger carried the war too, just differently. "I'll think about it," Ethan finally said. Janice handed him motel paperwork and food vouchers. Then, after a pause, she added quietly, "Thank you for your service." There it was again. The sentence everybody knew. The sentence that cost nothing. Outside the office, Ethan stood in the cold wind holding paperwork while traffic moved through downtown Missoula behind him. "Thank you for your service, but no ranch, no home, no future. No room anywhere permanent for a 63-year-old veteran and an aging combat dog." Ranger nudged Ethan's hand gently. The dog could always sense when the darkness started creeping close. That evening, Ethan called Luke from the motel room. His son answered on the 3rd ring, sounding tired. "Dad, hey. You okay?" Ethan looked around the cheap motel room. Peeling wallpaper. Buzzing heater. Ranger asleep beside the bed. "No," Ethan answered honestly again. Silence on the line. Luke exhaled slowly. "I've been talking to Melissa." Ethan closed his eyes. There it was. The careful tone people used before disappointing someone they loved. "We just..." Luke struggled for words. "The medical bills after Emma's surgery kinda buried us, Dad. And the apartment's already cramped and... You don't have to explain." Another silence. Ethan could hear his granddaughter, laughing faintly somewhere in the background. Luke lowered his voice. "I'm trying. I know you are." And he did. Luke wasn't weak, just trapped. The same way Ethan had been trapped for years inside debt, mortgage payments, land disputes, and the quiet, suffocating pressure of trying to hold a life together after Elaine got sick. "I love you, Dad." "Love you too." After the call ended, Ethan sat alone on the motel bed, staring at nothing while Ranger rested his head across Ethan's knee. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Outside, fireworks exploded somewhere near the interstate. Sharp cracks. Instantly, Ethan's body locked tight. His breathing changed, fast, shallow. For one terrifying second, he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back in Helmand Province, watching smoke rise from a blown convoy while screaming filled the radio headset. Ranger reacted immediately. The shepherd climbed onto the bed and pressed hard against Ethan's chest, forcing physical contact, grounding him back into the room. "Easy," Ethan whispered hoarsely. Another firework cracked outside. Ranger remained against him until Ethan's breathing slowed. The dog had saved his life more than once overseas. Apparently he still was. Near midnight, Ethan took Ranger outside behind the motel. Snow drifted lightly now beneath the street lamps. The world had gone silent except for distant highway noise. Ranger suddenly stopped walking, ears forward, body stiff. Then, without warning, the dog lunged toward the tree line beyond the parking lot, barking violently into the darkness. Ethan grabbed the leash instinctively. Ranger! The shepherd strained hard enough to nearly pull Ethan off balance. Something moved between the trees, a shadow, then gone. Ethan stared into the darkness while cold wind moved through the pines. Far off beyond the motel and highway and sleeping town, the Bitterroot Mountains waited beneath fresh snow, and Ranger would not stop staring toward them. The dog stood rigid at the edge of the tree line behind the motel parking lot, breath steaming into the freezing air. His growl had faded now, replaced by something stranger, focus, intent. Like he was listening to a sound Ethan couldn't hear. Snow drifted through the yellow motel lights in slow spirals. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash and looked into the dark woods beyond the highway. Nothing moved anymore, just pine trees bending in the wind. Then Ranger pulled again, hard. Easy, Ethan muttered, but the shepherd refused to back down. He stared north toward the mountains with the same intensity he used to show before detecting explosives overseas. Ethan had trusted that instinct enough times to know better than to ignore it completely. Still, exhaustion won out. "Tomorrow," Ethan whispered. Ranger finally allowed himself to be led back toward the room, though he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the forest the entire way. The motel voucher expired 2 days later. Ethan stretched every dollar he had left buying dog food, gas, and coffee. By the third morning, the truck's transmission began slipping badly, climbing a frozen hill outside Lolo Pass. The old Ford groaned like dying machinery, before finally giving out entirely beside an abandoned logging pullout. Steam rolled from beneath the hood. Ethan sat behind the wheel, silently, while snow tapped against the windshield. "That's that," he said softly. Ranger whined once from the passenger seat. The tow company wanted more money than the truck itself was worth. By sunset, Ethan stood beside the highway with a backpack over one shoulder, while Ranger carried supplies in an old tactical saddlebag Ethan had used years earlier during mountain training exercises. The wind cut through his jacket immediately. Cars rushed past without slowing. The truck disappeared behind him on the back of a tow rig. Another piece of his life hauled away. He watched until the taillights vanished around the bend. Then he turned north toward the mountains. The Bitterroots rose enormous against a gray winter sky. Endless forests layered across the slopes like dark ocean waves frozen in place. Snow covered the upper ridges while low fog drifted between the trees. Ranger moved ahead confidently, not wandering, leading. That unsettled Ethan more than he wanted to admit. The forgotten forestry road appeared around midday. Half buried beneath snow and fallen branches, the narrow road cut west into the wilderness between two rusted warning signs so weathered. The lettering had nearly vanished. One sign still showed faint government markings beneath layers of corrosion. Property restricted, authorized access. Only Ranger stopped there. Ears forward, tail stiff. Then without hesitation, he stepped onto the abandoned road. Ethan frowned. Ranger, the dog kept moving. Snow crunched beneath Ethan's boots as he followed reluctantly into the trees. Pine branches sagged overhead beneath fresh snow, creating a tunnel of shadow that swallowed highway noise almost immediately. Silence settled around them, not peaceful silence, watchful silence. The deeper they walked, the stranger the landscape became. Old utility poles leaned crooked beside the road, with dead wires hanging loose between them. Concrete foundations emerged occasionally through the snow where structures had once stood. Ethan passed a collapsed guard shack, half consumed by vines and ice. Cold War infrastructure. Military, maybe. Or government. Hard to tell anymore. Ranger kept moving with unnatural certainty. Every so often the shepherd would stop completely, lift his nose into the air, then continue toward the mountains. Ethan checked the sky, storm building. Dark clouds gathered across the western ridges, swallowing the afternoon light earlier than expected. By evening, snow fell hard enough to erase the road behind them. The temperature dropped fast. Ethan's knees ached from the climb. His lower back burned with every step beneath the weight of the backpack. At 63, carrying gear through deep snow became less about toughness and more about stubbornness. The PTSD didn't help. Isolation sharpened old instincts. Every broken branch sounded deliberate. Every shadow between the trees looked human for half a second too long. At one point, Ethan spun suddenly at the sound of crunching snow behind them, heart hammering before realizing it was only loose ice falling from branches overhead. Ranger pressed briefly against his leg, grounding him, always grounding him. The storm became dangerous just after sunset. Wind tore through the forest, hard enough to bend trees sideways, while snow reduced visibility to almost nothing. Ethan stumbled crossing an old wooden bridge over a frozen creek and nearly fell through a section of collapsed boards. Pain shot through his left knee. He hit the snow hard. For several seconds, he couldn't breathe. Ranger immediately turned back, barking sharply beside him. "I'm fine," Ethan growled through clenched teeth. But he wasn't. The knee had started swelling instantly. He pushed himself upright slowly, while snow coated his shoulders and beard. Darkness thickened rapidly beneath the trees. Then Ranger took off, not running wildly, running with purpose. Ranger! The shepherd disappeared briefly through the storm before reappearing farther uphill, barking again. Calling him, Ethan limped after the dog, through chest-deep drifts between the pines, while wind screamed across the ridge overhead. Branches cracked somewhere in the darkness. Then suddenly the trees opened, and there it stood. The fire lookout cabin rose from the storm like a ghost preserved in ice, tall, weathered, built against the mountainside, overlooking a frozen valley far below. Rusted communication towers leaned beside it at strange angles, while old antennas protruded from the snow like skeletal remains. One window glowed faintly silver beneath the storm clouds, not light, just reflection. But for one disorienting second, Ethan thought someone might actually be inside watching them. The cabin looked abandoned, yet untouched, as if time itself had simply stopped there. Ranger ran directly toward the porch stairs. The wooden structure groaned beneath Ethan's boots as he climbed after him. Snow had piled waist-deep against one side of the building. The front door hung slightly crooked on old iron hinges, unlocked. That alone sent a cold feeling through Ethan's stomach. Nobody left remote wilderness cabins unlocked for decades, unless they expected someone to return. Wind pushed hard against Ethan's back as he opened the door. The hinges screamed softly. Dust and cold air rolled out from inside. The smell hit him immediately. Old wood, kerosene, rust. And beneath it all, military oil. The same scent that clung to weapons, lockers, and field equipment after years of storage. Ranger stepped inside first, then stopped completely. The dog's body went rigid. Low growl. Not fear, recognition. Ethan entered slowly behind him. The cabin interior emerged through darkness in pieces. Metal shelves, a cast-iron stove, maps pinned to walls, old radio equipment covered beneath canvas tarps. A narrow bunk near the far wall, and beside the bunk, combat boots, still sitting neatly where someone had left them. Snow hissed against the windows outside, while Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the room. Something about the place felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, interrupted. Like whoever lived here had walked outside one day, intending to come back, and never did. Ranger moved suddenly toward the back corner of the cabin. He began scratching violently at the floorboards beneath an old metal desk. Ethan crossed the room slowly. The dog barked once sharply and pawed harder at the wood. Then Ethan saw it. Fresh scratches, not old ones, fresh. Someone else had already searched this place recently. Outside, somewhere far below the mountain, an engine echoed faintly through the storm. Ranger lifted his head instantly toward the sound and growled. The engine noise echoed faintly through the storm, below the mountain, distorted by wind and trees until it sounded almost unreal. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the cabin, listening, while snow rattled against the walls. The sound faded, then silence returned. Ranger did not relax. The shepherd remained near the back corner of the room, staring toward the floorboards beneath the metal desk. His ears stayed forward, muscles tight beneath his black coat. Ethan shut the cabin door carefully behind him. The old lock no longer worked. That bothered him immediately. Every survival instinct he possessed whispered the same thing. Someone had been here recently. The cabin should have felt abandoned. Instead, it felt paused, like life had stopped halfway through a sentence. Ethan moved slowly through the room, boots creaking across warped wooden boards. Dust covered most surfaces, but not evenly. Some places looked untouched for decades. Others showed faint signs of disturbance. The cast-iron stove still contained old ashes. A chipped enamel coffee cup sat beside the sink. Military maps hung yellowed and curling along one wall beneath cracked plastic covers. Coordinates had been marked in faded red pencil across large sections of northern Idaho and western Montana. Cold War territory, communication corridors maybe. Training zones, hard to tell. Ranger barked once sharply from the corner. "I hear you," Ethan muttered. The desk was bolted to the floor. Rusted radio equipment sat on top beside stacks of weather-damaged notebooks. Ethan reached down and brushed dust aside carefully. Fresh scrape marks. Definitely recent. Something heavy had been moved there within the last few weeks. He crouched slowly beside the floorboards while pain flared through his swollen knee. Ranger immediately pressed close beside him. The dog smelled faintly of wet pine and snow. "You keeping me alive again?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger nudged his shoulder. The boards themselves looked old, but one section near the walls sat slightly uneven compared to the others. Ethan pressed against it experimentally, solid, but not permanent. His pulse slowed. The same feeling returned. Recognition. Somewhere deep in the back of his memory, Ethan recalled old intelligence, safe houses overseas built exactly this way. Hidden compartments beneath ordinary structures, emergency storage, dead drops. Someone trained had built this cabin. That much became obvious. Wind moaned outside while darkness thickened beyond the windows. Ethan forced himself to focus on survival first. Mysteries could wait until morning. The storm outside could not. The woodpile beside the stove was old but mostly dry beneath a tarp. Ethan worked quietly for nearly an hour cleaning the flue pipe and rebuilding the firebox, while Ranger patrolled the cabin room to room, like he was clearing a structure. Combat habits never really disappeared. Eventually the stove caught. Orange light flickered across the walls, while heat slowly pushed back the mountain cold. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something dangerous, relief. He sat heavily beside the stove, rubbing warmth back into his hands, while Ranger finally lay down near the bunk, though the dog still kept glancing toward the hidden floorboards beneath the desk. Snow continued falling outside. The storm sealed the mountain off from the rest of the world. That night, Ethan explored the cabin properly. The storage room in back had once been some kind of communications center. Rusted equipment racks lined the walls beside crates, stamped with faded military inventory codes. Most had already been emptied long ago. Not all of them. One crate still contained vacuum-sealed emergency blankets and military ration packs, so old the labels had turned brown. Another held radio batteries manufactured in 1986. The dates unsettled him. Everything here stopped around the same period. On a shelf near the bunk, Ethan found several books swollen from moisture. Military strategy manuals. survival guides, a worn Bible, and one framed photograph. The glass had cracked diagonally through the center, but the image remained visible beneath the dust. Three men stood beside the cabin sometime during the late 1980s. One wore marine dress blues. Another stood in civilian clothes beside a government vehicle. The third man was younger than the others, with dark hair and sharp features. He looked familiar. Not personally familiar, professionally familiar. The kind of face Ethan had seen years later in magazines and defense contractor reports. Powerful, connected, Ranger suddenly stood again, low growl. Ethan followed the dog's gaze toward the photograph. The shepherd stared directly at the younger man in the picture. Then Ranger backed away slowly. That chilled Ethan more than he expected. Dogs remembered things differently than humans did. Emotion, scent, threat. Sometimes memories stayed buried in them long after people forgot. A noise outside interrupted the thought. Crunching snow. Close. Ethan extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Ranger moved silently beside the window. Another crunch, slow footsteps. Someone outside. Ethan's heartbeat remained strangely calm now. The fear had passed hours earlier somewhere during the climb through the storm. What replaced it felt older than fear. Operational focus. He crouched beside the wall, listening carefully while wind hissed through the trees. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then a flashlight beam swept briefly across the front window. Ranger's lips curled back soundlessly. Ethan stayed completely still. The beam lingered another second, then disappeared. Footsteps retreated slowly through the snow. A vehicle engine started somewhere downhill several minutes later. This time Ethan heard it clearly. Not imagination, not PSD. Someone knew the cabin was occupied. The realization settled heavily into the room after the engine noise vanished. Ranger moved back toward Ethan and sat beside him without taking his eyes off the door. "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "I know neither of them slept much." Morning came gray and bitterly cold. Fresh snow buried the porch nearly knee-deep. Ethan stepped outside, carrying an old coffee tin, and stopped immediately. Tracks. 2 sets. One belonged to the vehicle, the other belonged to a man. Large boots, military style. The tracks circled the cabin twice before disappearing back toward the road. Ranger sniffed them intensely, hackles rising along his spine. Then the dog suddenly looked uphill toward the deeper wilderness beyond the cabin. Not downhill. Not toward the road. Uphill, toward the mountains above them. Ethan followed his gaze. Pine forests climbed endlessly into fog and snow. Somewhere, higher up the slope, partially hidden through the trees, stood the rusted remains of a communications tower, leaning crooked against the sky. Something about it bothered Ranger deeply. The dog would not look away. By noon, the storm had mostly passed. Weak winter sunlight filtered through the clouds while Ethan searched the area surrounding the cabin. The place sat alone in a clearing overlooking a frozen valley hundreds of feet below. No nearby structures, no power lines, no modern roads, isolation. Perfect isolation. Yet signs of the old government site remained everywhere. Concrete foundations buried beneath snow, collapsed antennas, cable trenches cutting through the trees. Whatever this place had once been, somebody had spent serious money building it, and somebody else had spent serious effort abandoning it quietly. Ethan found the water pump beside the cabin frozen solid beneath layers of ice. He spent nearly an hour forcing it loose before rusty water finally sputtered from the pipe. The simple act of fixing something steadied him more than he expected. For months his life had been nothing but loss, paperwork, debt, funeral arrangements, court notices, watching strangers inventory his property like scavengers after Elaine died. But this made sense. Wood, water, fire, problems you could solve with your hands. By afternoon, smoke rose steadily from the cabin chimney, while Ethan repaired broken shutters and reinforced the front door with scavenged lumber. from an old equipment shed nearby. Ranger followed him constantly, except whenever Ethan moved near the radio tower uphill. Then the dog became anxious, restless. At sunset, Ethan finally noticed the trail, half buried beneath snow beyond the clearing. Old boot prints leading uphill toward the tower. Recent boot prints. Someone had walked there within the last 48 hours. The same someone who came to the cabin last night. Ranger growled low beside him again. And for the first time since arriving on the mountain, Ethan realized something important. This cabin had not been forgotten. Someone was still watching it. And whatever they were protecting had survived, hidden up here for nearly 40 years. The realization settled into Ethan's chest like cold iron. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the fresh boot prints leading uphill toward the radio tower, while wind moved through the pine trees around him in long, hollow breaths. Ranger remained beside him, body rigid, eyes fixed on the mountain slope above. The dog knew something, not imagined danger, not ghosts from Ethan's PSD, something real. The winter light faded early behind thick clouds rolling across the Bitterroots. Ethan studied the tracks one final time before returning toward the cabin. No point chasing anyone uphill after dark, not with one bad knee, not with temperatures dropping again, and not when whoever climbed that mountain clearly knew the terrain better than he did. Inside, the cabin glowed softly from the fire stove. Shadows moved across the walls, while snow whispered against the windows. For the first time in months, Ethan cooked a real meal. Beans from an old ration tin, rice, coffee heated in a dented metal pot, nothing special but warm. Ranger lay near the stove, watching Ethan constantly while chewing dried meat from the emergency supplies. Every so often, the shepherd's ears twitched toward noises outside. The mountain never truly went silent. Branches creaked, ice shifted, wind carried distant sounds strangely through the valleys. Still, beneath all of it, Ethan sensed another presence now: observation. The feeling reminded him of surveillance zones overseas where enemy fighters watched from hidden ridges waiting for mistakes. He hated how naturally his mind slipped back into those memories. War never really ended for men like him. It simply changed scenery. After eating, Ethan sat beside the desk where Ranger had discovered the uneven floorboards. The old notebooks stacked there contained weather reports, radio frequencies, and maintenance schedules dating back to the late 1980s. Most entries ended abruptly around December 1987. That date appeared repeatedly. December 3, December 8, December 11, then nothing. The handwriting belonged to several different people. But one signature appeared more than the others. C. Mercer, Caleb Mercer. Ethan leaned back slowly. Walter Boone had mentioned the name the previous afternoon, when he came down from the mountain trail carrying firewood strapped across an old mule. The retired forest ranger had nearly frozen in place after seeing the cabin occupied again. "You shouldn't be up here," Walter had said quietly, while staring at Ranger. Ethan remembered the old man clearly, tall despite his age, gray beard, heavy coat patched at both elbows, the kind of face carved by decades of mountain winters. When Ethan mentioned the photograph inside the cabin, Walter's expression changed immediately. "You found his picture? You knew him?" Walter stared toward the radio tower for a long moment before answering. "Everybody around here knew Caleb Mercer once." That was all he would say before leaving. But now Ethan understood something else. Walter had been afraid. The realization unsettled him almost as much as the tracks. Ranger stood abruptly and crossed the room, straight to the floorboards again. The dog scratched harder this time, claws scraping wood violently enough to shake dust from the desk. "All right," Ethan muttered. He grabbed a crowbar from the storage room and knelt beside the uneven boards. His knee protested immediately. Ranger backed away slightly but remained tense. Ethan wedged the crowbar beneath the seam and pulled. The board resisted at first, then lifted suddenly with a sharp crack. A hollow space waited beneath. Both Ethan and Ranger froze. Inside the compartment sat a rectangular object wrapped tightly in dark oilcloth. Not large, maybe 2 feet long. Dust coated the edges, but the wrapping itself remained mostly intact. Protected, preserved. Ethan carefully lifted the package onto the desk. His pulse slowed strangely. The same sensation he used to feel before opening classified materials overseas. Ranger stood close beside him now, whining softly. "You found it," Ethan whispered. The oilcloth peeled away stiffly. Underneath sat a metal military lockbox, scratched and dented with age. The hinges groaned when Ethan forced it open. Inside were rows of cassette tapes, VHS recordings, photographs, and several thick journals wrapped in plastic. The smell hit him instantly. Old paper, magnetic tape, machine oil, memory. Ranger suddenly barked sharply toward the door. Ethan looked up instinctively. Nothing outside, just darkness pressing against the windows. But the dog remained alert. Ethan turned back toward the box and picked up one of the photographs. 3 men stood beside military vehicles near what looked like an overseas airstrip sometime during the late 1980s. One face immediately caught Ethan's attention. Older, sharp jaw. Expensive suit despite the desert surroundings. He knew that face now, not from memory, from television. Gavin Mercer, or rather a younger version of the same family. The man in the photograph resembled him almost perfectly. His father. Titan Ridge security. Ethan's stomach tightened. Another photograph showed military cargo containers stacked beside helicopters, marked with government insignia. Several crates carried serial numbers partially blacked out with marker. Weapons shipments, maybe, or something worse. The journals disturbed him more. Detailed entries filled hundreds of pages in tight, precise handwriting. Coordinates, operation names, personnel transfers, payment records, and repeated references to missing service members officially killed during training accidents. Ethan read one line twice. Transport team lost during Cascade exercise. File sealed another. No survivors confirmed. Yet beside several names, someone had written handwritten notes in red ink. "Not dead." Moved, Ranger growled low again. Outside, snow crunched softly near the porch. Ethan extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the cabin. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a flashlight beam swept briefly across the lower corner of the window. Someone was there, watching. Ethan barely breathed. Ranger stood completely motionless beside him. The beam disappeared after several seconds. Footsteps retreated slowly into the snow. Then nothing. Ethan waited another full minute before relighting the lantern. His hands no longer trembled. Fear had burned away. What replaced it was colder purpose. He reached for one of the VHS tapes. The label read, Mercer, final recording 1987. The cabin still contained an old battery-powered television and VCR unit stored beneath a tarp near the communications equipment. It took nearly 20 minutes to get the machine functioning again, using backup batteries from the storage room. Static filled the screen first, then a face appeared. Caleb Mercer, older than in the photograph, tired. A bruise darkened one side of his jaw. Behind him, Ethan recognized the cabin itself. Same walls, same desk, same room. The tape crackled badly. Caleb looked directly into the camera. "If someone finds this," he said quietly, "they already know I didn't disappear willingly." Ranger stood instantly, ears forward, whining softly at the screen. Ethan felt cold spread through his chest. Caleb continued speaking. He described illegal military operations tied to private contractors during the late Cold War years. Weapons movements hidden through off-book transport routes. Missing personnel reassigned instead of killed. Government officials accepting payments to bury investigations. Several times, Caleb glanced nervously toward the cabin windows while speaking. "They'll come back for this place eventually," he said. And if they do, it means somebody finally got too close. The tape distorted violently for several seconds. Then Caleb leaned closer to the camera. If they find me before this gets out. Headlights suddenly flashed across the cabin windows. Bright close, Ranger exploded into barking. Ethan killed the television immediately and moved toward the door, while engine noise echoed from somewhere just beyond the trees. Not one vehicle, two. The lights remained visible through the storm for several seconds, before slowly shutting off outside the clearing. Whoever arrived this time wasn't just watching anymore. They were coming up the mountain. The headlights glowed through the trees below the cabin, like pale animal eyes moving slowly through falling snow. Ranger barked furiously beside the window, every muscle in his body taut beneath his black coat. Ethan killed the lantern again. Darkness swallowed the room except for the faint orange glow leaking from the stove. Outside, engines idled, two vehicles heavy, SUVs by the sound of them. The same cold awareness Ethan had carried through combat zones settled into place behind his ribs. Exhaustion disappeared, grief disappeared. Fear narrowed itself into focus, movement, timing, distance. Ranger paced silently between the front door and windows, nails clicking softly against the floorboards. The shepherd had shifted completely into working mode now. Not pet, not companion, operator. Ethan crouched beside the wall and listened. Doors opened outside, men talking low. One laugh carried faintly through the storm before disappearing beneath the wind. Flashlights moved through the clearing. Then footsteps climbed the porch stairs. 3 sharp knocks hit the front door. Not aggressive, confident. Ranger exploded into snarling. "Mr. Cole," a voice called calmly through the wood. "We know you're inside." Ethan remained silent. The voice continued. "My name is Gavin Mercer. I'd appreciate a conversation before this situation becomes unpleasant for everyone involved." Mercer. The name landed heavily in Ethan's chest. Ranger growled deeper. Ethan moved carefully toward the side window and lifted the curtain slightly. 3 men stood outside beneath falling snow. The first looked about 50, tall. Expensive winter coat, gray hair cut short, calm posture. Everything about him projected controlled authority. Beside him stood a massive man in tactical gear, with broad shoulders and a shaved head. His face looked flattened from old fights. Snow collected across the collar of his black jacket, while one gloved hand rested casually near his belt. The third man stayed near the SUVs below, holding a flashlight. Security. Professional. Gavin Mercer stepped closer to the porch. "I'm not law enforcement," he said. "I'm trying to avoid involving them." Ranger lunged toward the door, hard enough to shake the hinges. "Easy," Ethan whispered. The dog obeyed instantly but stayed rigid. Mercer heard the command. "Beautiful shepherd," he said. "Military?" Ethan opened the door halfway. Cold air and snow swept immediately into the cabin. Mercer studied him carefully. No surprise crossed his face, almost like he already knew exactly who Ethan Cole was. The big man beside him watched Ranger instead, not nervous, evaluating. That bothered Ethan immediately. Mercer removed one leather glove slowly. "You've found yourself somewhere complicated, Mr. Cole." "You know my name," Ethan replied. Mercer smiled faintly. "This mountain belongs to Titan Ridge Security. Technically, you're trespassing on federal contract property." "Funny," Ethan said quietly. "Didn't see any signs." Mercer glanced toward the storm. "Most people don't wander this far." Ranger stepped between Ethan and the doorway. The big man shifted slightly at that. Mercer noticed. "So the dog's protective. He's smart." Mercer nodded once. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Snow drifted sideways through the porch light mounted above the cabin door. Somewhere down in the valley, wind moved through the pines like distant surf. Then Mercer's eyes shifted briefly toward the desk inside, toward the open lockbox. Only for a second, but Ethan saw it and understood immediately. This wasn't about trespassing. They knew about the hidden compartment. Mercer looked back at Ethan calmly. "I'd like to make this simple," he said. "You leave tonight, we arrange transportation, and nobody asks uncomfortable questions. And if I don't," the smile disappeared, "then this becomes difficult." Ranger growled again. The large man beside Mercer finally spoke for the first time. "Dogs should calm down." His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. Ethan looked directly at him. "Dogs usually write about people." A flicker crossed the man's face then. Annoyance, maybe. Mercer raised one hand slightly. "Cole Braddock," he said casually. "Former contractor. Don't mind him. He sees threats everywhere." "Occupational hazard," Braddock muttered. Ethan noticed the scars across the man's knuckles. Military, too. Or mercenary. Sometimes there wasn't much difference anymore. Mercer stepped closer to the doorway. "You served with Naval Special Warfare, correct?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "How much homework did you do before driving up here?" Mercer ignored the question. "You understand classified operations, national security, sensitive materials. You threatening me or recruiting me?" That earned the faintest smile again. "Neither." Mercer's gaze drifted once more toward the desk. "You found things in this cabin that don't belong to you. Maybe. They belong to the man who disappeared." For the first time, something shifted behind Mercer's calm expression. Very small, very fast, but real. "Caleb Mercer abandoned this property decades ago." "Did he?" Braddock moved slightly forward. Ranger barked explosively. The shepherd's teeth flashed white in the darkness. Braddock stopped instantly. Mercer studied Ranger with more interest now. "That dog's impressive. He's the reason I'm still alive." A long silence followed. Wind rattled the radio tower uphill somewhere beyond the trees. Finally, Mercer sighed quietly. "You seem like a reasonable man, Mr. Cole. So let me be direct." His voice lowered slightly. "Some histories are dangerous to disturb, especially for people already carrying enough pain." The words hit harder than Ethan expected, because Mercer wasn't guessing. He knew about the PTSD, the VA records, the counseling refusals, the repossession, the foreclosure. How much had they dug into his life already? Mercer continued calmly. "You've had a difficult year. Losing your wife, losing your home." He paused. "This doesn't need to become worse." Ethan's entire body went still. Ranger sensed it immediately. The dog pressed against Ethan's leg, grounding him again. "How do you know about Elaine?" Ethan asked quietly. Mercer's expression never changed. "We make it our business to know who enters our property." "No, not property. Containment zone." That was what this really was. A place under quiet surveillance for 40 years, protecting secrets. Ethan suddenly understood the break-ins at his ranch, the searching, the black SUV following him. They thought he had found something before coming here, and now they were trying to contain the situation. Mercer reached slowly into his coat pocket. Braddock tensed instantly beside him. Ranger growled low. Mercer removed only a business card. "Take a day," he said. "Think carefully, then call me." Ethan looked at the card but didn't take it. Mercer slid it onto the porch railing instead. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "You and the dog won't survive long up here alone. We've survived worse." For the first time, Mercer looked directly into Ethan's eyes long enough for the politeness to fade completely. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe you have." Then he turned and stepped off the porch. Braddock lingered 1 second longer, staring at Ranger. The dog stared back without blinking. Something passed silently between them. Recognition. Violence recognizing violence. Then Braddock followed Mercer toward the SUVs. Engines roared alive minutes later. Headlights swept across the clearing one final time before disappearing downhill through the snowstorm. Ranger remained at the doorway long after the vehicles vanished. Ethan finally picked up the business card from the railing. Gavin Mercer, Executive Director, Titan Ridge Security. No phone number handwritten. No instructions. because Mercer expected Ethan to call eventually. The certainty behind that unsettled him deeply. Inside, the cabin suddenly felt smaller. The hidden tapes on the desk no longer looked like old evidence. They looked radioactive. Ranger returned to the desk and sat beside the lockbox, guarding it. Ethan stared at the VHS tapes scattered across the wood while snow hammered the windows harder outside. Then he noticed something else. The front door lock. Fresh scrape marks around the handle. Not from tonight. Older, someone had already forced entry recently. Mercer wasn't searching for the evidence anymore. He was checking whether it was still here. That realization tightened Ethan's chest. He crossed to the window again and looked down the mountain road. No headlights visible now, only darkness and snow. But the feeling remained: observation, pressure, containment. Ranger suddenly moved toward the back storage room again. The shepherd sniffed aggressively near the wall before barking sharply. Ethan followed. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the flashlight beam caught it. Mud. Fresh mud smeared across the floorboards near the storage shelves. Not theirs. Someone had entered the cabin while Ethan and Ranger were down in the valley days earlier, and whoever it was had searched the room carefully. One storage crate sat slightly out of place, the lid half open. Ethan crouched slowly and looked inside, empty now. But dust outlines revealed something rectangular had once been stored there recently. Removed. The implications hit him hard. The hidden compartment wasn't the only secret in this cabin. And somewhere on this mountain, someone else was still searching for whatever Caleb Mercer left behind. Outside, thunder rolled faintly through the Bitterroots while Ranger returned to the window, overlooking the mountain slope. The dog growled again. Not downhill this time, uphill, toward the radio tower hidden in the storm. Ranger would not look away from it. The dog stood near the cabin window, ears rigid, growling low enough that Ethan felt the vibration more than heard it. Outside, snow drifted through the darkness in long silver sheets while the crooked radio tower disappeared and reappeared between gusts of wind. Something up there had Ranger terrified or angry. With working dogs, sometimes the two feelings looked the same. Ethan rubbed exhaustion from his eyes and glanced at the old wall clock hanging crooked beside the stove. Past midnight, the mountain felt impossibly isolated now. No cell service, no nearby town, no backup. Only snow and trees and the hidden evidence scattered across the cabin desk like live explosives. He should have left. That was the rational choice. Take Ranger and disappear before Titan Ridge decided politeness was no longer useful. But Caleb Mercer's face kept returning in Ethan's mind. The bruised jaw, the fear behind the eyes, and the sentence burned into Ethan's memory now. If someone finds this, they already know I didn't disappear willingly. Ranger suddenly barked sharply toward the porch. Ethan grabbed the flashlight beside the stove. Silence outside. Then a faint metallic sound. Not from the clearing, from behind the cabin. Ethan moved carefully toward the rear window while Ranger pressed ahead of him. The dog's body had lowered into full defensive posture now, combat ready. The flashlight beam swept across the trees. Nothing. Then Ethan saw it. A shape moving fast between the pines behind the woodpile. Human. Gone almost instantly. Ranger exploded toward the back door. Ranger. Too late. The shepherd burst outside into knee-deep snow, barking furiously into the darkness. Ethan followed with the flashlight beam jumping wildly across the woods. Branches cracked uphill. Running footsteps. Whoever had been there was fleeing toward the radio tower. Ranger chased hard through the snow. Ranger, back, the dog ignored him. Ethan cursed under his breath and pushed after them, knee screaming with every step. Snow hammered his face while darkness swallowed the trail almost immediately beyond the clearing. Then Ranger barked again, different this time. Pain. Ethan's stomach dropped. Ranger. He forced himself uphill faster. The flashlight finally caught movement beside a fallen pine 20 yards ahead. Ranger staggered into view. Something dark hung from the side of his mouth. Meat. The shepherd collapsed briefly into the snow, growling weakly while trying to stand again. Poison. Ethan reached him just as Ranger's legs buckled completely. No, no, no. The meat smelled chemical even through the freezing air. The trap hadn't been meant to kill quickly. It was meant to disable. Ranger's muscles spasmed violently beneath Ethan's hands. The dog tried to stand again anyway, still trying to protect him. Even now, Ethan's chest tightened so hard he could barely breathe. "Stay with me, buddy." Ranger whimpered softly. The sound nearly broke him. Ethan scooped the 70-pound shepherd into his arms and started downhill through the storm. Snow swallowed his boots nearly to the knee while branches clawed at his coat and face. His lungs burned. His knee threatened to collapse entirely. But he kept moving. He had carried wounded men before. Friends, teammates. Some survived, some didn't. Not this dog. Not Ranger. The cabin lights appeared faintly through the storm below, but Ethan ignored them completely. No supplies there could help. Only one person on this mountain might know what to do. Walter Boone. The old ranger lived nearly a mile downhill, through thick timber beyond the service road. A brutal walk in good weather. Tonight it felt endless. Ranger convulsed again in Ethan's arms. Stay awake. Snow and sweat soaked through Ethan's jacket, while panic tightened around his ribs harder with every passing minute. PTSD memories crashed into him suddenly without warning. Afghanistan. Dust. Blood. A medic screaming for plasma. The smell of burned metal. Ethan stumbled hard against a buried rock and nearly fell. Focus. He forced the memories back. One step, then another. The old ranger's cabin finally appeared through the trees, almost 40 minutes later. Warm yellow light glowed from the windows. Ethan slammed against the porch door hard enough to shake the walls. Walter. The old man opened the door holding a shotgun, then saw Ranger. Everything changed instantly, inside. Now. Walter cleared the kitchen table in seconds, while Ethan laid Ranger across it carefully. The shepherd's breathing had become shallow and uneven. Walter leaned close to the dog's mouth. "Poisoned," he muttered. "Jesus Christ. You can help him." Walter was already moving. Maybe. Old veterinary supplies filled a rusted cabinet near the sink. Walter worked with terrifying speed for an 82-year-old man, mixing liquids and crushing tablets, while Ethan held Ranger, still through another seizure. The dog's eyes rolled briefly toward Ethan, still fighting, always fighting. "You hear me?" Ethan whispered. "You don't quit on me." Walter forced medicine carefully down Ranger's throat. "Keep him awake." Ethan stroked the shepherd's neck continuously, while snow battered the cabin roof overhead. Minutes crawled by. Then Ranger's convulsions slowly eased, not gone, but weaker. Walter exhaled heavily. He might make it, might. The word hit Ethan like a punch. He lowered his head briefly against Ranger's shoulder. For several seconds he couldn't speak at all. Walter watched him quietly. Then the old ranger glanced toward the mountain through the window. "They finally moved against you faster than I expected." Ethan looked up sharply. "You knew this would happen?" Walter stayed silent too long. That was answer enough. "You knew Caleb Mercer too," Ethan said quietly. The old man sat heavily in a chair near the stove. Snowlight reflected dimly across his lined face. "Caleb wasn't crazy," Walter said finally. "That's what everybody told themselves after he disappeared. Easier that way." Ethan stared at him. Walter rubbed both hands together slowly. "I helped him once." The words barely rose above the storm. Ethan said nothing. Walter continued staring into the fire. "Back in '87, Caleb brought me documents. Boxes of them. Said people were disappearing over what they knew." He paused. I thought he was paranoid. "And now?" Walter looked toward Ranger lying weakly across the table. "Now, your dog's poisoned because somebody climbed a mountain during a blizzard trying to silence a dead man." Silence settled heavily through the cabin. Then Ranger lifted his head weakly, growled. Walter's eyes narrowed instantly toward the window. Orange light flickered faintly through the trees outside. Not lightning. Fire. "Oh God," Walter whispered. Ethan moved to the window. Flames spread fast behind the cabin uphill through the timber near the old service road. Wind drove sparks violently between the trees, accelerant, deliberate. "They're trying to flush us out," Walter said. The fire raced downhill terrifyingly fast. Ethan grabbed buckets immediately. "You stay with the dog," Walter snorted. "Hell with that." The old man reached for heavy coats hanging near the door while Ethan stared at him. "You can barely walk uphill." Walter chambered a shell into the shotgun calmly. "I've fought bigger fires than this." Outside, heat and smoke slammed into them immediately. Flames climbed through dead pine branches with frightening speed while wind scattered embers across the snow-covered ground. Ethan and Walter worked frantically, hauling water from a half-frozen cistern behind the cabin. The smoke grew thicker every minute. Trees cracked overhead. A burning branch crashed nearby, spraying sparks across the snow. Ethan barely noticed the pain in his knee anymore. Only motion, water, smoke, survival. Then something crashed behind him. Ranger, weak but standing. The shepherd limped through the snow toward Ethan, despite barely being able to walk. "Ranger, no!" the dog barked once sharply. A second later, a burning pine split apart above Ethan's position. Ranger slammed into his leg hard enough to knock him sideways. The tree crashed exactly where Ethan had been standing. Flames exploded upward into the night. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared. The dog had saved him again, even poisoned, even dying. Ranger collapsed into the snow afterward, trembling violently. Ethan dropped beside him immediately. "You stubborn idiot." His voice broke completely. Walter reached them through the smoke, coughing hard. "We gotta move." Together, they dragged hoses and buckets through the freezing darkness for nearly 2 hours, before the fire finally slowed against deeper snowfields higher on the ridge. By dawn, only blackened trees and smoking ground remained behind the cabin. Walter sat heavily on a log, breathing hard. Ranger lay beside Ethan, wrapped in blankets near the porch. Alive, barely. The rising sun turned the snowy mountains pale gold beyond the valley, while smoke drifted through the broken timber like ghosts. Walter stared toward the radio tower above them, then finally said the words Ethan had been dreading. "There's something else you need to know." Ethan looked at him. Walter's weathered face tightened. Caleb Mercer built an emergency bunker somewhere beneath that tower. The mountains suddenly felt much larger and far more dangerous. Because if the bunker still existed, then whatever Titan Ridge feared, most might still be hidden inside it. The fire smoldered behind the cabin all morning. Black smoke drifted slowly through the pines while melted snow hissed against buried embers beneath the burned trees. The mountains looked deceptively peaceful again beneath pale winter sunlight, but nothing about the clearing felt safe anymore. Ranger slept near the stove, wrapped in blankets. His breathing had steadied. That alone felt like a miracle. Ethan sat beside him, sharpening an old hunting knife slowly, while Walter Boone boiled coffee over the fire. Neither man spoke much. Exhaustion hung over the cabin like another storm cloud. Finally, Walter set down the coffee pot. "You need to understand something about Caleb Mercer," he said quietly. Ethan looked up. Walter stared into the fire. "Caleb wasn't just military intelligence. He was one of the smartest men I ever knew." He paused, paranoid too, but smart enough that his paranoia kept him alive longer than most. "Alive longer?" Walter nodded slightly. "He always believed somebody would come looking eventually. That's why he built the bunker." Ranger lifted his head weakly at the word bunker. The shepherd's ears twitched toward the mountain again. Ethan noticed immediately. "Dog's been trying to lead us there since we arrived." Walter rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Then maybe he smells something. The old ranger stood slowly and crossed toward a shelf near the window. From behind several rusted supply tins, he pulled an old folded map secured with twine. The paper crackled with age. Walter spread it carefully across the table. The map showed the mountain ridge surrounding the cabin, with faded markings and handwritten notes in red pencil. Old service tunnels, communication lines, observation posts, and near the radio tower, a circled X. Walter tapped it once. Caleb showed me this after the government shut the station down in '87. Said he needed somewhere the company couldn't find. Titan Ridge, not just a defense contractor. A shadow buried inside old military operations. The realization settled deeper into Ethan now with every passing hour. Walter looked toward Ranger. If the bunker's still intact, Caleb hit it well. Ranger stood abruptly, still weak, still shaky, but focused. The dog limped toward the cabin door and barked once sharply. Ethan exchanged a glance with Walter, then reached for his coat. The climb uphill took nearly 40 minutes through deep snow and burned timber. Smoke drifted between blackened tree trunks, while the rusted radio tower loomed larger above them with every step. Ranger led the way, not wandering, tracking. The shepherd moved carefully now because of the poison still weakening him, but his focus never broke. Every few yards he stopped to sniff the wind before continuing toward the tower. The structure itself looked close to collapse. Rust consumed most of the steel framework, while old communication dishes hung crooked against the mountain sky. Ice coated the support cables. The place felt abandoned by history itself. Yet Ranger circled the base repeatedly, nose pressed against the snow. Then suddenly he began digging, violently. Snow sprayed backward beneath his paws. Ethan dropped beside him immediately. "What is it?" The dog barked once and scratched harder. Walter moved closer slowly, eyes narrowing. There, partially buried beneath snow and dead branches, Ethan finally saw the edge of metal hidden beside a concrete support foundation. A hatch camouflaged. The steel door blended almost perfectly into the mountain itself, beneath decades of debris. Walter exhaled softly. "I'll be damned." The hatch resisted at first, then groaned open beneath Ethan's weight. Cold air rushed upward from below, carrying the smell of rust, concrete, and stale underground air untouched for decades. Darkness waited beneath. Metal stairs descended into the mountain. Ranger went first, without hesitation. His nails echoed sharply against the steel steps, while Ethan followed with a flashlight beam, cutting through dust and shadow. The bunker stretched farther underground than Ethan expected. Concrete walls, emergency lighting strips long dead, rows of communication, equipment lining narrow corridors. Some Cold War survival station, built to disappear completely beneath the mountain. Walter descended behind them, slowly muttering under his breath. "Caleb never told me it was this big." Ranger moved deeper into the bunker with growing urgency. The flashlight beam swept across shelves, stacked with boxes sealed in military plastic wrap. Filing cabinets lined one wall beside reel-to-reel recording equipment and stacks of labeled tapes. Evidence. Enough evidence to bury careers, maybe governments. Ethan opened the nearest cabinet. Inside sat hundreds of photographs, surveillance images, cargo manifests, bank records, military operation summaries stamped classified. Walter stared in disbelief. "My God!" Ranger barked sharply from farther inside. They followed the sound into the largest chamber at the rear of the bunker and stopped cold. Maps covered the walls floor to ceiling. Not just local maps, international, trade routes, airfields, shipping ports, military transport corridors spanning decades. Red lines connected locations across multiple countries, weapons movements, covert operations, black money. Everything Caleb Mercer had tried to expose lived down here beneath the mountain. Ethan's flashlight landed on one wall filled with photographs of service members, dozens of them. some labeled deceased. Others marked missing during training accidents or overseas operations. Yet, handwritten notes beside the photos suggested something different. Relocated, silence transferred. One name made Ethan freeze. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hurst. Ethan remembered him clearly. A SEAL communications specialist officially killed during a training accident in Alaska, nearly 20 years earlier. Except Ethan had attended the closed briefing afterward. No body recovered. Questions buried immediately. And now here was Hurst's photograph pinned to a bunker wall beneath the word, "Eliminated after discovery." A cold sickness moved through Ethan's chest. The room tilted briefly. PTSD memories surged without warning. Dusty roads overseas, gunfire. A convoy burning beneath desert heat. Voices screaming over broken radios. Ethan braced both hands against a table, breathing hard, while Ranger immediately pressed against his leg, grounding him. Back to the mountain, back to now. Walter watched him carefully. "You all right?" Ethan nodded once. Lie. Then he saw the next file, his own name, typed neatly across a classified operations folder. Ethan Cole NSW attached operations support. Cascade mirror program. His pulse stopped completely for one terrible second. Ethan opened the file with numb hands. Inside were mission reports from his final overseas deployment nearly 15 years earlier. Black operation transport escorts, civilian extractions, cargo recovery. The paperwork looked routine at first. Then he noticed the discrepancies. Coordinates altered. Civilian casualty numbers erased. Entire sections redacted. One report described a raid Ethan remembered vividly. A compound in Eastern Europe. Intel claimed illegal weapons trafficking connected to terrorist groups. The firefight had gone sideways immediately. Civilians died, children among them. Ethan carried those memories every night since. But according to Caleb's documents, the compound hadn't belonged to terrorists. It belonged to Titan Ridge intermediaries. The mission itself may have been designed to erase witnesses. Ethan staggered backwards slightly. "No." Walter looked over his shoulder. Neither man spoke, because suddenly the corruption wasn't distant anymore. It sat directly inside Ethan's own past. Ranger barked again near the far wall. This time the dog stood beside another photograph, partially hidden behind a map. Ethan moved closer slowly. The flashlight beam revealed an older man, standing outside a small stone building, somewhere snowy and remote. Gray beard, thin frame, a scar across one cheek. Walter frowned. "I know that face." The photograph had been taken recently, not decades ago, and beneath it, Caleb Mercer had written 3 words in red ink. "Still alive." Wyoming silence swallowed the bunker. Walter stared at the image for a very long time. "You're telling me Caleb survived all this time?" Ethan barely heard him, because another realization had already arrived. If Caleb Mercer was alive, then Titan Ridge wasn't protecting old secrets anymore. They were hunting a living witness. A sudden sound echoed faintly above them. Metal, movement. Ranger spun instantly toward the bunker stairs, growling hard enough to vibrate the concrete floor. Ethan killed the flashlight. Darkness slammed over the bunker. Then headlights appeared briefly through the narrow ventilation grates overhead. Someone else had reached the tower, and this time they might already know exactly where the hatch was hidden. The bunker dropped into absolute silence. Ranger's growl rolled low through the darkness beside Ethan, while faint vibrations echoed from above them, through the steel ventilation shafts. Snow crunched overhead, boots, at least 2 men, maybe more. Ethan's flashlight remained off. The darkness inside the bunker felt alive now, thick with cold air and buried secrets. Walter Boone stood motionless near the filing cabinets, barely breathing. Another sound echoed above. Metal scraping, the hatch. "They found it," Walter whispered. Ranger shifted closer to the stairs immediately, protecting the exit. Ethan's mind moved quickly now despite exhaustion. Every instinct from years in the teams surfaced automatically. Containment, observation, escape routes. The bunker had only one visible entrance, a death trap if Titan Ridge sealed it. Ethan swept the flashlight briefly across the walls, searching desperately for another exit. Old conduit tunnels disappeared deeper into the mountain behind equipment racks, but most had collapsed long ago beneath rock slides and rusted debris. No easy way out. The hatch groaned faintly overhead, opening. Ranger barked sharply. Voices drifted down from above. "Careful," somebody muttered, Cole Braddock. Ethan recognized the gravel voice instantly. Another beam of light appeared at the top of the stairwell, moving cautiously downward. Walter's face tightened. "They'll kill everybody in here," Ethan believed him. Titan Ridge had spent 40 years burying this mountain. They wouldn't hesitate now. Then Ranger did something unexpected. The shepherd suddenly turned away from the stairs and sprinted deeper into the bunker, barking sharply toward the rear corridor. Ethan followed immediately. Ranger, the dog, stopped beside a rusted maintenance door partially hidden behind stacked crates. Ranger scratched violently at the lower hinges. Ethan grabbed the handle, locked. Walter caught up beside him. There used to be service tunnels connecting the old generator rooms. The flashlight beam swept across the doorframe. A faded sign remained barely visible beneath rust. "Emergency access." Ethan kicked the lock hard once, twice. The old metal finally snapped open. Cold air rushed through from the darkness beyond. Behind them, footsteps echoed halfway down the bunker stairs now. Flashlights searched the main chamber. Braddock's voice carried clearly. "Spread out." Ranger lunged through the maintenance corridor first. The tunnel beyond was narrow and claustrophobic, lined with pipes and crumbling concrete walls slick with moisture. Ethan slammed the door shut behind them, just as voices entered the bunker chamber fully. No lock. No barricade, only darkness. They moved fast. Walter struggled to keep pace through the narrow tunnel, while Ranger led ahead confidently despite the pitch black. Then the mountain shook suddenly behind them. A heavy crash echoed through the bunker. They collapsed the entrance. Walter breathed. Titan Ridge wasn't searching anymore. They were sealing the bunker permanently. The tunnel twisted downward sharply, before opening into an old generator chamber, half flooded with icy groundwater. Rusted machinery filled the room beneath hanging chains and broken electrical cables. Ranger barked toward the far wall. Another door, this one already hanging open. Snowlight filtered faintly through cracks beyond it. Escape. Ethan pushed Walter ahead, while the dog remained strangely alert behind them, listening toward the collapsing bunker tunnels. The exit emerged halfway down the mountainside beneath thick brush and fallen timber nearly 200 yards below the radio tower. Fresh snow blinded Ethan momentarily after the underground darkness. Wind hit hard again. Above them, voices shouted faintly near the tower. They hadn't discovered the escape tunnel yet, but they would. Walter bent over, coughing violently. "We need help." Ethan looked toward the valley below. "Who do we trust?" Walter hesitated, then finally answered. "One person." The drive into town happened after sunset. Walter's old pickup rattled violently down the icy mountain roads, while Ranger slept across the back seat wrapped in blankets. The shepherd still looked weak from the poison, but his breathing had improved steadily. Ethan sat beside him, holding the classified folder containing his own operation records. He still couldn't fully process what he'd seen underground. The missions, the lies, the possibility that Titan Ridge manipulated military operations for profit. Worst of all, the civilians. Faces Ethan had spent years trying to forget returned now sharper than ever. A little girl in a ruined apartment building. Smoke drifting through shattered concrete. Blood on Ethan's gloves while helicopters circled overhead. Not collateral damage. Witnesses. The realization hollowed him out. Walter drove silently through the snow-covered roads until the lights of a tiny mountain town finally appeared below. Hamilton, Montana. Quiet, half asleep beneath winter weather. Walter parked behind a closed feed store near the railroad tracks. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked. Walter nodded once. "She's the only reporter crazy enough to touch Titan Ridge." 5 minutes later, they entered a small newspaper office above an old hardware store. Lights still burned inside despite the late hour. Stacks of papers covered every surface. Coffee cups, photographs, maps pinned across walls. A woman in her late 30s sat behind a desk, typing furiously, while jazz music played softly from an old radio nearby. She looked up immediately when the door opened. Dark hair, sharp eyes, exhausted expression. The kind of person who hadn't slept properly in years. "Walter Boone," she said slowly. "You usually call before appearing after midnight." Then she noticed Ethan and Ranger. Her expression changed. Walter closed the door carefully behind them. "Naomi," he said quietly, "you were right about Titan Ridge." The room went silent. Naomi Reyes stood slowly from behind the desk. For the next 2 hours, Ethan and Walter unloaded everything onto the table. The tapes, the photographs, the bunker maps, Caleb Mercer's recordings. Naomi barely interrupted once. She simply listened while photographing documents continuously with shaking hands. At one point, she stopped completely staring at one shipment manifest. "Oh my God." "What?" She turned the paper toward Ethan. The document showed weapons shipments rerouted through shell corporations tied to military contractors during the late Cold War. One company name appeared repeatedly. Titan Ridge Holdings. Naomi looked pale now. "I've spent 3 years chasing rumors about these people." She glanced toward the bunker files. "You realize what this is?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Enough to get us killed." "That too." Ranger suddenly lifted his head from the floor. Alert again. Naomi noticed immediately. "Dog senses people before they arrive, usually." The shepherd walked directly toward a filing cabinet near Naomi's desk and sat beside it, staring upward. Naomi frowned. "What is it, boy?" Ranger nudged the lower drawer with his nose. Naomi opened it slowly. Inside sat old newspaper clippings and missing persons files tied together with rubber bands. Caleb Mercer's name appeared across the top file. Ethan looked at her sharply. "You've been investigating him." Naomi nodded. "Not just him, veterans disappearing, land seizures, dead witnesses." She paused. "People around here learned long ago not to ask questions." Walter crossed his arms heavily. "Well, somebody's asking now." Naomi pulled another photograph from the file. An older man standing outside a stone buildings surrounded by snow-covered pines. Same photograph from the bunker. Caleb Mercer, alive. "This came from Wyoming," Naomi said quietly. "A veterans monastery near Jackson Hole. Anonymous source mailed it to me 8 months ago." Ethan stared at the image. 40 years hiding. 40 years erased from his own life. "What if he's still there?" Ethan asked. Naomi met his eyes carefully. "Then Titan Ridge has spent decades hunting a man who never stopped surviving." Silence settled across the office. Outside, snow drifted beneath the streetlights, while distant freight trains echoed through the valley. Ranger walked slowly back to Ethan and rested his head against Ethan's knee, grounding him again. Always grounding him. Naomi looked down at the dog thoughtfully. "What's his name?" "Ranger. He saved your life?" "More than once." Naomi nodded toward the bunker files. "Then I think he just saved a lot more than that." The office phone rang suddenly. All 4 of them froze. Nobody moved. The ringing continued sharp and loud in the silence. Naomi answered carefully. "Ridgeline Gazette." Her face changed almost immediately. Fear, then controlled calm. "No," she said slowly into the phone. "I haven't heard from him." Click. She lowered the receiver quietly. "Who was it?" Walter asked. Naomi stared toward Ethan. "Titan Ridge Security." The room felt instantly colder. "What did they want?" Naomi's voice dropped almost to a whisper. They asked if I'd seen a homeless veteran traveling with a black German shepherd. Ranger growled softly beside Ethan's chair. And somewhere far above the sleeping Montana valleys, hidden beneath snow and burned timber, the mountain bunker waited in darkness, no longer buried, no longer forgotten, and no longer safe. Snow fell steadily across Hamilton through the early morning hours, while Naomi Reyes worked beside the office windows under a single desk lamp, surrounded by stacks of evidence pulled from the bunker beneath the mountain. Photographs, shipment records, military operation files, names, dates. Enough secrets to destroy careers stretching back 40 years. Ethan sat in silence near the old radiator, with Ranger asleep at his feet. The shepherd twitched occasionally in his sleep, paws jerking as if chasing something through snow. Walter Boone drank coffee beside the door, staring out toward the empty street. Nobody trusted the quiet anymore. Naomi finally lowered another document slowly onto the desk. They buried everything through shell corporations, she muttered. Land seizures, missing personnel, weapons contracts, all hidden behind private security operations. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the operation files again, the civilians, the falsified reports. The realization that some of the worst memories haunting him for 15 years had been manufactured by men sitting safely inside boardrooms. Not war, business. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, alert. The dog stared toward the street, below the office windows. A moment later, headlights rolled slowly past outside. Black SUV, no markings. The vehicle kept moving, but too slowly, watching. Walter noticed too. They found us. Naomi stood immediately. Then we moved faster. By sunrise, she had already transmitted copies of the bunker evidence to 3 separate journalists outside Montana, along with encrypted backups uploaded through protected servers. Insurance. If anything happened now, the story survived. Still, Naomi looked pale while working, because Titan Ridge wasn't just another corrupt company anymore. They were connected everywhere. Judges, sheriffs, military contractors, possibly federal agencies. The deeper the evidence went, the larger the shadow became. Ethan finally asked the question sitting inside him all night. What happens when this goes public? Naomi looked up from her laptop. People panic, Walter grunted softly. She means powerful people panic. Naomi nodded once. And powerful people get dangerous when cornered. The office phone rang again. Everybody froze. Ranger stood instantly. Naomi answered carefully. This is Reyes. Her expression changed immediately. Not fear this time, shock. Slow down, she said. She grabbed a notepad quickly while listening. Ethan watched her write one name in large letters. Caleb Mercer. When the call ended, Naomi looked directly at Ethan. The monastery confirmed he's there. Silence filled the room, alive, after 40 years. Walter sat down heavily in his chair. Jesus. Naomi grabbed her coat immediately. We leave now. The drive to Wyoming took nearly 12 hours through snow-covered highways and frozen mountain passes. Walter remained behind in Hamilton organizing backups of the evidence, while Ethan, Naomi, and Ranger headed south beneath heavy winter skies. The farther they drove, the quieter Ethan became. Ranger rested beside him in the back seat, fully awake now, though still weakened from the poison. Every so often, the shepherd leaned against Ethan's arm, grounding him silently. Outside, the American West rolled endlessly beneath winter. White valleys, black pine forests, abandoned gas stations, frozen rivers cutting through empty plains. The landscape looked enormous enough to swallow people forever. Maybe that was why Caleb Mercer survived so long. Places like this knew how to hide things. Late the following afternoon, they reached the monastery. The stone buildings sat isolated at the base of the Tetons, surrounded by snow-covered fields and towering pines. Smoke drifted from chimneys into pale blue air, while church bells echoed softly across the valley. Peaceful, almost painfully peaceful. A gray-haired monk greeted them at the gate. When Naomi mentioned Caleb Mercer's name, the old man studied Ethan carefully before finally nodding. He's been expecting this day for a long time. They found Caleb sitting alone beside a greenhouse overlooking the mountains. Ethan recognized him immediately despite the decades. Older now, thinner, white beard covering most of his face. But the eyes remained the same as the man from the tapes. Sharp, alert, still carrying fear. Caleb looked first at Naomi, then at Ethan, then finally at Ranger. Everything changed when he saw the dog. Caleb stood slowly. His hands trembled slightly against the cane beside him. "That's impossible," he whispered. Ranger stared at him intensely. Then, to Ethan's astonishment, the shepherd walked directly toward Caleb without hesitation. Tail low, focused. Caleb knelt carefully despite obvious pain in his knees, then spoke 3 quiet words. "Hold, watch, guard, old commands." Ranger froze instantly beside him. "Perfect resonance position," Ethan stared. How does he know those commands? Caleb's eyes never left the dog. "Because I helped design them." Silence settled over the snowy courtyard. Naomi looked stunned. Caleb rested one trembling hand against Ranger's neck. "Blackwater K9 line," he said softly. "Late-stage tactical shepherd program. We trained them for military recon during the 80s. Ethan's chest tightened. Ranger whined quietly against Caleb's hand. Recognition. Somehow the bloodline remained. A living thread connecting decades of buried history. Caleb finally looked up at Ethan. "You found the mountain." "Not a question." Ethan nodded slowly. "And Titan Ridge found us." Something old and exhausted passed through Caleb's face then. Not surprise, confirmation. "They never stopped watching that place," he whispered. "The monastery offered them shelter for the night." Snow fell again outside while Caleb sat across from Ethan and Naomi inside a small stone library warmed by firelight. For hours he told the story, the real story. Titan Ridge began during the Cold War as a covert logistics network operating beneath official military oversight. At first, they moved weapons quietly through black operations overseas. Then came human trafficking. Witness disappearances, illegal arms sales. Entire operations erased through falsified military records. Anyone who learned too much either vanished or became useful. Caleb discovered the truth in 1987 while working intelligence analysis at the mountain station above the bunker. When he tried exposing it, Titan Ridge responded immediately. Threats, surveillance, break-ins. Then the night they came for him. 3 men, one carrying kerosene, another holding a pistol fitted with a suppressor. "They told me I could disappear quietly or violently," Caleb said softly. The room remained completely silent, except for fire crackling in the hearth. "They drove me to a bus station in Idaho at 2 in the morning, wearing nothing but a coat and boots." His voice never rose. "They expected me to freeze before sunrise." Ranger rested beside Caleb's chair, listening quietly. Caleb reached down absent-mindedly, stroking the dog's ears. "I spent 40 years hiding because every institution that should have protected me was already owned." Ethan looked down at his hands. The same feeling kept returning now. Betrayal deeper than anger. He had spent his entire adult life believing corruption existed somewhere else. Overseas. Enemy governments, failed states. Not here, not wearing flags and defense contracts. Caleb studied Ethan carefully. "You saw your file." Ethan nodded once. Caleb's expression tightened painfully. "You weren't part of it knowingly, but I still carried out the missions." "You carried out orders." The words didn't help. Nothing could. Naomi finally leaned forward. "If you testify publicly, this becomes national." Caleb stared into the fire for a very long time. Snow hissed softly against the monastery windows. Finally he nodded once. "I'm tired of hiding." The decision changed everything. Within 48 hours, Naomi's first article exploded across national media. The Mountain Files. 40 years of corruption inside Titan Ridge security, photographs from the bunker spread everywhere online. Missing veterans, illegal land seizures, secret military contracts. And at the center of it all, a former intelligence officer who had survived in hiding for 4 decades. The response was immediate. Cable news trucks descended on Hamilton. Federal investigators requested evidence access. Veterans' families began contacting Naomi nonstop with stories of disappeared relatives and sealed military records dating back decades. Then came the threats, anonymous calls, vehicles following them, emails warning Naomi to stop publishing. One message simply read, "The mountain should have burned. Ranger sensed danger before anyone else now." The dog stayed glued beside Ethan constantly, watching every parking lot, every stranger, every passing vehicle. One evening outside a federal courthouse in Billings, a black sedan slowed beside the sidewalk where Ethan stood with Naomi. The rear window rolled halfway down. Cole Braddock stared out from inside. No expression, no words. Then the car drove away. Ranger barked furiously after it. 2 days later, federal hearings officially opened. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, veterans, investigators, and families carrying photographs of missing sons and brothers. Ethan sat quietly beside Caleb Mercer, waiting to testify, while cameras flashed constantly around them. Ranger lay beneath Ethan's chair wearing a simple black service harness Naomi had purchased before the hearing. The dog had become symbolic now, the poisoned shepherd who guarded the mountain evidence. America loved symbols, but Ethan barely noticed the attention, because across the courtroom sat Gavin Mercer. Perfect suit, perfect posture, calm expression, like none of this frightened him at all. That unsettled Ethan more than outright rage would have. Then the hearing began, and for the first time in 40 years, the mountain started talking back. The hearings lasted nearly 3 weeks. By the end of the first day, national news channels were broadcasting photographs from the bunker across every screen in America. Missing veterans, secret operation files, financial records, and Titan Ridge security to judges, sheriffs, defense contracts, and illegal land seizures stretching across decades. Families packed the courtroom daily. Some carried faded military photographs, folded carefully in old wallets. Others brought unopened letters returned by the government years earlier, stamped "deceased in service." Now those families sat in silence, listening to Caleb Mercer calmly explain how entire lives had been erased through paperwork and fear. Ethan testified on the 4th morning. The courtroom felt too warm, too crowded. Every sound sharpened beneath the PTSD tightening slowly inside his chest. Camera shutters, whispering reporters, the scrape of chairs across the floor. Ranger sensed it immediately. The shepherd rested his head gently against Ethan's boot beneath the witness stand, while federal attorneys asked questions about the bunker files and Ethan's military records. At first, Ethan answered steadily. Dates, operations, the mountain station. Then they showed mission footage from Eastern Europe. Everything changed. The screen displayed burned buildings beneath helicopter floodlights, while radio chatter echoed through the courtroom speakers. Ethan's breathing shortened instantly. Dust, smoke, children screaming. For one terrible second, the courtroom disappeared entirely. He was back there again. Gunfire cracking through narrow streets, blood on his gloves, the smell of burning fuel. Ethan gripped the edge of the witness stand so hard his knuckles whitened. Ranger stood immediately. The dog pressed firmly against Ethan's leg, grounding him with solid warmth and familiar weight. The courtroom fell silent, watching the shepherd steady the former SEAL without a single command. Ethan finally forced air back into his lungs, then looked directly toward the federal investigators. "We were told those targets were enemy trafficking cells," he said quietly. But they weren't. No sound moved in the courtroom. They were witnesses, Ethan continued. And some of us spent years believing we failed overseas when the truth is we were lied to by people making money off the chaos. Across the room, Gavin Mercer watched silently. No emotion, no surprise. That calmness disturbed Ethan more than anger ever could. Then Caleb Mercer testified. The old man walked slowly toward the witness stand, using his cane, while every camera in the courtroom followed him. He looked impossibly small beneath the bright lights and towering ceilings. But when he spoke, the room listened. Caleb described the mountain station, the illegal operations. The night Titan Ridge men dragged him from the cabin and abandoned him at a bus station during a blizzard. He described spending 40 years hiding because every system designed to protect citizens had already been purchased by the people hunting him. Then the federal prosecutor asked the question everyone feared. Do you recognize anyone involved in those operations still active today? Caleb looked slowly across the courtroom. Finally, his eyes settled on Gavin Mercer. Yes, silence hit the room like impact. Reporters leaned forward instantly. Gavin remained perfectly still. Caleb's voice never changed. His father built the system. Gavin protected it. For the first time all morning, something cracked slightly behind Gavin Mercer's expression. Not panic, not guilt, fatigue. Like a man watching an old dam finally collapse after decades holding pressure behind it. Outside the courthouse, protesters and veterans gathered daily despite freezing weather. American flags snapped violently in the wind beside handmade signs demanding investigations into missing service members. Ranger became unexpectedly famous. Footage of the black German Shepherd protecting Ethan during testimony spread online across the country. News stations replayed clips of the poisoned dog standing beside the former SEAL while discussing corruption inside military contracting. People sent letters, money, dog food. Veterans began arriving outside the courthouse simply to shake Ethan's hand and kneel beside Ranger. One older Marine quietly pressed a challenge coin into Ethan's palm and whispered, "You both kept fighting when nobody else did." Ethan carried that coin afterward in his pocket every day. 3 nights later, everything changed again. Naomi burst into the motel room just after midnight, carrying her laptop. There running. Ethan sat upright instantly. What? Mercer. Naomi turned the screen toward him. Private flight filed out of Bozeman, headed for Belize. Federal investigators moved within hours. News helicopters filmed Gavin Mercer's arrest at a private airfield just before dawn. Cameras captured federal agents, leading him across the snow-covered runway in handcuffs, while reporters shouted questions through the wind. Cole Braddock disappeared completely. Nobody could find him. That unsettled Ethan deeply. The hearings ended 2 weeks later. Titan Ridge executives faced federal indictments tied to fraud, conspiracy, illegal weapons trafficking, witness intimidation, and corruption connected to military contracts stretching back decades. Several retired officials lost pensions and security clearances overnight. Investigations expanded across multiple states. The mountain had finally cracked open. But for Ethan, the strangest feeling afterward wasn't victory. It was exhaustion. A lifetime of tension, slowly leaving his body all at once. Spring arrived late in the Bitterroots. Snow melted gradually across the mountainsides, revealing black earth and fresh green beneath the burned trees around the cabin. Streams swelled with runoff, while fog drifted softly through the valleys each morning. The cabin survived, scarred, smoke blackened in places, but standing. Ethan returned there with Ranger. The first week of April. The mountain looked different now in daylight, less haunted. Walter Boone waited outside the cabin porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee when Ethan arrived. "You look terrible," the old ranger said. Ethan laughed softly for the first time in months. "So do you." Walter handed him a cup. Ranger trotted slowly across the clearing, sniffing the spring air while birds moved through the trees overhead. The shepherd still carried scars from the poisoning, but some invisible tension inside him had eased. He no longer stared constantly toward the woods. That mattered more to Ethan than he could explain. Naomi arrived 3 days later, carrying lumber and groceries in the back of an old pickup truck. "You know," she said while climbing out, "most people celebrate surviving federal conspiracies somewhere tropical." Ethan looked around the clearing. Fresh mountain air, pine trees swaying softly, smoke rising from the stove chimney. "This place grows on you." Together they rebuilt slowly. Walter repaired the porch. Naomi patched windows. Ethan reinforced the burned wall beside the woodshed, while Ranger supervised constantly from the clearing, like a foreman refusing retirement. Luke arrived the following weekend with Ethan's granddaughter, Emma. The little girl stepped from the truck clutching a stuffed rabbit and stared wide-eyed at the mountains surrounding the cabin. Then Ranger approached carefully. Emma froze. Ranger sat directly in front of her and lowered his head gently. 5 seconds later, she wrapped both arms around the shepherd's neck. "Dad," Luke whispered quietly while watching them, "I haven't seen you smile like that since Mom died." Ethan hadn't realized he was smiling until then. The silence around the cabin changed too. Not empty anymore. Peaceful. Morning routines settled naturally into place. Coffee beside the stove. Repair work beneath blue mountain skies. Ranger sleeping near the porch in warm sunlight. Evenings watching fog roll through the valleys, while spring thaw filled the streams below. Sometimes Ethan still woke from nightmares. But now Ranger simply rested his head against the bed until the shaking passed. And gradually, the shaking came less often. One afternoon, Caleb Mercer climbed the mountain for the first time in 40 years. The old man moved slowly with his cane, stopping often along the trail, while Ethan waited near the clearing beside Ranger. When Caleb finally saw the cabin again, he stopped completely. No words, just silence. The mountain wind moved gently through the pines around them. Ranger approached first. Caleb knelt carefully despite obvious pain and rested one trembling hand against the dog's neck. Then he looked toward Ethan. "You brought it back to life." Ethan glanced at the repaired walls, the rebuilt porch, the smoke curling peacefully from the chimney. "No," he said quietly. "I think it brought me back." Caleb smiled faintly. That evening they sat together outside the cabin, watching sunset pour gold across the Bitterroots. For a long time nobody spoke. Then Caleb reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded document. "Property transfer papers." "I'm too old for mountains," he said softly. "But you belong here." Ethan stared at the papers. "Caleb, I mean it." The old man looked toward Ranger lying peacefully beside the porch steps. "That dog led you here for a reason." Ethan looked across the valley, glowing amber beneath the setting sun. Home. Not the ranch he lost. Not the house filled with 35 years of memories and grief. This, a scarred cabin on a mountain where broken people kept surviving anyway. Ranger lifted his head suddenly near the porch. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The shepherd stared toward the bunker ridge one final time, then slowly rested his head back onto his paws. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, Ranger stopped standing watch. The change was small at first, almost invisible. The black German shepherd no longer woke at every sound outside the cabin. He no longer paced the perimeter before dawn, checking tree lines and shadows with military precision. Some mornings Ethan found him stretched beside the porch in sunlight sleeping, so deeply his paws twitched against dreams instead of danger. Peace had finally reached the dog before it reached the man. Spring settled fully over the Bitterroots. Snow disappeared from the lower ridges first, revealing dark earth and fields of wild grass moving softly beneath mountain wind. Meltwater rushed through the creeks below the cabin, carrying winter away in cold silver currents. Life returned everywhere, birdsong in the mornings, the smell of pine warming beneath sunlight, the steady rhythm of hammers and saws as Ethan rebuilt the last damaged sections of the cabin roof. Sometimes Ethan stopped working simply to listen. No sirens, no engines climbing the mountain, no helicopters overhead, just wind moving through trees older than memory. The federal investigations expanded rapidly after the hearings. Every week, Naomi called with new updates from Washington. Additional arrests, sealed military contracts reopened, hidden payments traced through offshore accounts. 3 former defense officials resigned under investigation tied to Titan Ridge operations stretching back to the late Cold War. One evening, Naomi arrived at the cabin carrying groceries and a thick envelope sealed with federal markings. Walter Boones sat outside sharpening fishing hooks, while Caleb Mercer rested nearby beneath a blanket, watching clouds drift over the valley. Naomi handed the envelope carefully to Ethan. "You should open it sitting down." Ethan frowned slightly. "That bad?" "Depends how you look at it." Inside were copies of expanded federal indictments. Dozens of names, contractors, politicians, military officers, judges, and one line highlighted heavily near the center of the report. "Stolen veteran benefit funds." Ethan read it twice, then slowly lowered the papers. "They were stealing from veterans too," Naomi nodded quietly. "For years." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything from the bunker, because corruption was one thing, but stealing from wounded soldiers, men already broken by war, that crossed into something colder. Walter spat into the grass beside his chair. "Some people got no bottom." Caleb stared quietly toward the mountains. "They stopped seeing human beings a long time ago." Ranger lifted his head beside Ethan's boots, sensing the tension rising again. The dog rested his muzzle gently against Ethan's knee, grounding him, always grounding him. Naomi reached deeper into the envelope. "There's more." She handed Ethan a small cassette tape sealed inside an evidence bag. "Old audio recovery." Bunker stairs. Ethan stared at it, the final tape. The one discovered hidden beneath loose concrete during the last federal search of the bunker. Caleb recognized it immediately. His face lost color. "I recorded that 2 nights before they came for me." Nobody spoke. Even the mountain wind outside seemed to quiet. Naomi placed an old portable tape recorder onto the kitchen table beside the lantern. "Federal investigators copied it already," she said softly. "But I thought you should hear it here, at the cabin where everything began." Sunset faded slowly beyond the windows while Ethan inserted the tape carefully into the recorder. Static crackled. Then Caleb Mercer's younger voice filled the room, strong, sharp, afraid beneath the surface. "If anyone finds this," the voice said, "it means they failed to destroy everything." The tape continued for nearly 20 minutes. Names, operation codes, hidden bank accounts. Detailed descriptions of illegal shipments moved through military channels using dead veterans' identities. At one point, younger Caleb paused on the recording, then said something softer. "If they come for me, understand this clearly. The danger was never only overseas." Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest, because those words explained his entire life. Every nightmare, every broken memory, every moment standing in grocery store aisles, scanning strangers for threats he could never fully name. He had spent years believing war followed him home. But home had always been infected already, by greed, by corruption, by men hiding behind patriotism while destroying the very people they claimed to protect. The tape ended with one final sentence spoken quietly into static. "Take care of the dogs. They always knew who the good men were." Silence filled the cabin afterward. Nobody moved. Ranger slept peacefully beside the stove, unaware that an old soldier's final warning had just crossed 4 decades to reach them. Caleb wiped at his eyes once quickly before looking away toward the darkening windows. Walter cleared his throat roughly. Naomi shut off the recorder gently. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Bitterroot Mountains. Something inside Ethan finally loosened. Not healed completely, maybe never fully healed, but lighter. As if the mountain had been carrying some invisible weight all these years, waiting for someone to finally hear the truth buried beneath it. The federal investigation eventually spread nationwide. News channels called it one of the largest corruption scandals involving veterans and defense contracts in modern American history. Books were written, documentaries filmed, politicians promised reforms beneath television lights, but none of that mattered much on the mountain. Life there remained simple, real. Morning coffee beside the porch, repairing fences, watching mist drift through valleys below sunrise. Ranger chasing squirrels again, like an ordinary dog instead of a soldier. That might have been the greatest miracle of all. One afternoon in late June, Ethan walked slowly up toward the old radio tower, carrying a wooden post across one shoulder. Ranger followed beside him through tall grass, moving in warm wind. The burned tower still stood partially collapsed against the ridgeline, rusted steel reaching toward open sky like old bones. Below it stretched the memorial garden Ethan had planted for missing veterans connected to Titan Ridge. Simple wooden markers, wildflowers, American flags moving softly in mountain air. Ethan set the final wooden post into the ground carefully, then stepped back. The marker read, "For those who never came." Home Ranger sat quietly beside him. No growling, no tension, just silence, peaceful silence. Ethan looked out across the endless mountains rolling west beneath golden afternoon light. A year ago, he had stood outside a sheriff's office in cold rain, watching his life scatter across wet pavement. Homeless, broken, invisible. He remembered strangers walking past him without stopping. Remembered the humiliation of gathering his military medals from mud while deputies looked away. Back then he believed losing the ranch had ended his life. Now he understood something different. The ranch had been a house. This mountain became a home. There was a difference. A house could be stolen through paperwork and lies, but home was loyalty, home was survival. Home was the hand that reached back for you when the darkness closed in. Home was a scarred shepherd, refusing to leave his side beside highways and blizzards and burning forests. Home was old soldiers drinking coffee at sunrise without needing to explain their silence. That evening, Ethan sat outside the restored cabin, while sunset flooded the Bitterroot's gold and amber. Walter snored lightly in the chair beside the porch. Caleb read quietly beneath a lantern. Naomi laughed somewhere inside the cabin, while Luke and Emma helped prepare dinner. And Ranger rested beside Ethan's boots, watching the valley below. The shepherd looked older now, gray beginning around the muzzle, scars visible beneath black fur, but peaceful, finally peaceful. The mountain air cooled slowly as daylight faded. Somewhere down in the valley, an owl called through the trees. Ethan reached down, absently resting one hand against Ranger's neck. The dog lifted his head briefly, then settled again. No tension, no alert posture, no watching the tree line. For the first time in decades, neither soldier was waiting for the next attack. The wind moved softly through the pines around the cabin. The mountain stood quiet at last, and beside the fading firelight, Ranger closed his eyes. Not guarding, not searching, simply resting beside the man he never abandoned, at home. If you believe loyalty still matters in this country, type "home" down in the comments. And if you've ever had to fight to keep your dignity when life tried to take everything from you, drop a 1 below. Subscribe if you'd like more stories about justice, old ranch towns, forgotten heroes, and the people who refuse to quit when the world turns its back on them.